You can hear the static and the clipped syllables of a voice coming across a narrow slice of radio spectrum as a white-suited figure feels for the next rung and tests a boot on aluminum that looks impossibly fragile against the black. July 1969 is the date people remember, and that single moment is the postcard memory the world filed away. But if you only keep the postcard, you miss the expedition. The truth is bigger, faster, and more demanding than nostalgia suggests. In the span of just 3 years, the United States executed 6 landings on the moon, each one advancing from showpiece to fieldwork, from "can we get there" to "can we get answers." In modern aerospace, we would spread a test program of that complexity over a decade and a half, and still argue about risk readiness at every gate review. Back then, the cadence was brutal, and the appetite for learning by doing was unlike anything current program managers would sign off on. The surprising part isn't that it worked. The surprising part is how much we learned under that tempo, and how methodically operations evolved from seat-of-the-pants heroics to repeatable precision. The second landing often gets filed under the one after the first, which is a disservice to what actually happened. November 1969. The same 3 stages of explosive chemistry stacked into a shape tall enough to make you instinctively step backward when you stand beneath it. The crew was Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Al Bean, strapped into a spacecraft that didn't know it was headed for a lightning rod roll as much as a lunar landing. Their departure window opened into lousy Florida weather. And the risk calculus of the day, schedule pressure, presidential attendance, and a rally round the flag mood meant the countdown kept ticking. 36 seconds off the pad, the stack got hit. It's not dramatic in the way Hollywood would stage it. There's no blue-white bolt on camera, only instrument panels washing out with warnings as the vehicle's nervous system was shocked into nonsense. 16 seconds later, another strike. The guidance computer briefly didn't know which way was up. Telemetry was garbled, and for a few beats it was the kind of quiet you only get when every person in the loop is holding their breath and doing math at the speed of fear. What kept the flight alive was not luck. It was the obsessive training culture that forces weird failure modes into muscle memory. A controller, ECOM, the one watching the electricals, recognized a pattern from sim runs and pushed a fix that was so obscure it's become legend. Switch the signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary. Capcom relayed it. Bean found the buried toggle on a left-hand panel that almost nobody ever touched. The spacecraft's senses reset. Guidance came back. Attitude stabilized. You don't get that save without 1,000 hours of sims and a team stubborn enough to rehearse for problems nobody expects. Once the fireworks were behind them, the entire point of Apollo 12 was to prove we could stop behaving like unguided guests on the moon and start behaving like surgeons. Apollo 11 had landed safely but several miles off its target. That's forgivable when you're inventing a technique. But science isn't built on somewhere nearby. So the second landing picked a specific target that couldn't be fudged. Surveyor 3, a robotic lander that had been sitting in Oceanus Procellarum since 1967. The bet was that we could thread the descent to a precise ellipse and drop the lander in the immediate neighborhood. When you watch the tapes of Conrad hopping down to the surface and then count the paces to that old robot, you're watching the difference between hope and control. The touchdown came on the lip of the small crater that cradled Surveyor. Closing that range to a couple hundred meters wasn't just bragging rights. It proved the entire navigation chain. State vector updates, radar lock, downrange targeting, throttle schedule could be dialed in tight enough to plan geology like a field campaign rather than a courtesy call. That mission was designed to inaugurate color television on the moon as well. A way to move beyond the grainy ghosts of Apollo 11. The camera they brought was a color Vidicon tube system, delicate and unforgiving. You don't point a Vidicon at the sun. On Earth, atmospheric scattering and 1,000 small mercies keep you from getting an instant autopsy of your optics. On the moon, unfiltered sunlight is a hard hammer. When Bean swung the camera toward the horizon, he briefly let the sun into the aperture. It took moments to burn the target inside the tube. The picture didn't fade, it died. Millions watching at home went from breathless color to nothing. Up on the loop, nobody panicked. The science didn't need the camera to live. The crew went about their work, and the mission pivoted the way good missions do. The plan exists so you know what you're deviating from, not because it's holy writ. The real payload for Apollo 12 wasn't television. It was a gray box with a small forest of sensors and a nuclear heart that would keep it alive when the crew was back on Earth. The Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, ALSEP, was a quiet revolution. You don't learn a world by visiting it for 30 hours and guessing. You learn it by leaving instruments behind that can listen for years. The central station drew heat from a compact radioisotope generator and fed a suite of instruments that could feel the steady pulse of the moon's cold interior and the flickers at its surface. The seismometer was the celebrity. Earthquakes make sense to humans because our planet is wet and mobile. It hisses and flexes all the time. The moon is airless, bone-dry, and old. When it vibrates, it sustains. When the ascent stage of the lander later hit the surface on purpose, the shock went into a medium that's less inclined to damp. The phrase "rang like a bell" is imprecise, but the intuition it carries is useful. The lunar crust is a rigid, fractured lattice, and once it's excited, it bleeds energy slowly. In ops terms, that sustained signal was gold because it told us how efficiently the moon stores and releases mechanical energy, which folds back into models of crustal thickness, fracture distribution, and the thermal history of the body. There's a footnote to Surveyor 3 worth addressing because it's been misreported for decades. The crew cut pieces off the old lander and brought them home, including a camera that had sat in a vacuum for 2 years. There were stories that viable microbes were found on the foam in that camera housing, a seductive idea that life can hitchhike and nap through airless cold. Later, more careful contamination control and review made it clear the positive cultures likely came from Earth during post-flight handling. It doesn't kill the romance of the idea. It restores our respect for how hard true panspermia would be, and how easy it is to fool yourself with lab contamination when you're hunting for exotic truths. Apollo 13 changed the tone of the room. Before that flight, everybody acknowledged the risk because it's fashionable to respect the tiger when you're a few feet outside the cage. After the oxygen tank blew, the tiger was inside with us. The immediate mechanical story is straightforward. A tank in the service module that had been damaged by a ground test oversight. Thermostats designed for 28 volts had been exposed to 65 volts, suffered insulation damage. When the stirrer motors ran during the flight, localized heating in the oxygen tank kicked off a chain of events that culminated in an explosion. The result wasn't just a loss of a consumable, it took out fuel cells. That meant the crew lost their main power, heat, and water source in one ugly step. All the training suddenly mattered, but not in the way the sim room had imagined. The lunar module, built to be a 2-person taxi for a few dozen hours, became a lifeboat for 3 men, and the entire trajectory plan was redrawn around conserving resources, making burns with the wrong engine at the wrong time for the right reasons, and riding a free return loop that would drape the mission around the backside of the moon and home again. From an operations perspective, it's a masterclass in what you pay for when you maintain redundant systems, cross-train your crew, and insist on crisp enumeration of constraints. From a public perspective, it was a reality check. The moon wasn't a playground. It was a place that demanded you get every decision right for days on end. That perception shift bled into politics and budgets. The canceled missions weren't yet announced, but the mood that would cancel them began with 13. It's one thing to say you're returning to flight. It's another thing to put a crew on a stack and go. Apollo 14, January 1971, was the program's proof that resilience wasn't just a press release. The command module was piloted by Stu Rosa, the lunar module by Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell. Shepard carried a special weight. He was the first American to touch space, a Mercury-era icon who had fought through an inner ear disorder that almost ended his career. At 47, he was older than the idealized jet jockey image. That maturity is underrated in a cockpit that punishes impatience. Their first major drama came in a place where the movies rarely spend time: docking. The mechanism that's supposed to make a solid, airtight connection between the command module and the lunar module wouldn't latch, even though alignment was nominal and the probe system had power.
Alignment good.
What you do in that moment is the difference between being an operator and being a passenger. They went to procedures. The probe could be reset. The capture latches could be cycled. The approach could be adjusted to a slightly different closure rate. Try again. Try again. When your mission is on the edge of an abort condition. Before you've even left Earth orbit, composure is logistics. Eventually, the hardware did what hardware usually does when you shepherd it correctly. It behaved. The landing at Fra Mauro is sometimes overshadowed by the television-friendly antics that followed, but that site was chosen precisely because it could answer geologic questions Apollo 11 and 12 weren't equipped to tackle. These were impact breccias, mega-regolith terrains churned by giant collisions. Sampling them wasn't a matter of scooping dust. It required careful core extractions and documented context. The touchdown error ellipse tightened again. Targeting refinements and a crew that had absorbed a new discipline of low-altitude piloting put the descent where it needed to be. If you ask what the public remembers about the EVA, you'll hear about Shepard swinging a club head improvised onto a sampling tool and sending a ball arcing away under 1/6 gravity. He joked about how far it flew. Operations folks remember that stunt only because it didn't interfere with the timeline. In truth, it's a welcome moment of levity in a program that otherwise communicated its achievements through data and grit. The more important legacy of 14 is the show of competence after 13. Systems work when you prepare correctly, and risk can be tamed without being denied. With Apollo 15, the mission changes species. The program divides the early landings from what we call the J missions, and 15 is the first of them. Longer stays, heavier science packages, a rover. You can't appreciate what the rover does in statistics alone, an electric buggy with a theoretical top speed that reads like a parking lot spec sheet, a range measured in tens of kilometers. The real value is that it turns the EVA from a radial walk into a mounted survey. Humans are lazy in the smartest ways. Wheels make our brains bigger. The lunar roving vehicle was essentially a magnesium chassis with wire mesh wheels, each corner driven, each wheel with its own little gearbox. Batteries sealed against the vacuum. Dust is the enemy of everything on the moon, abrasive and electrostatically clingy, and the rover taught us that immediately. Fender damage equaled rooster tails of grit that sandblast suits and optics, so crews became deft with tape, clamps, and whatever ingenuity kept the stuff off them. In an era that worships sleek renderings, the LRV was real engineering. Spartan, repairable, and sufficient. Dave Scott and Jim Irwin drove into landscapes that belong in a planetary textbook. Ancient mare basalts, wrinkle ridges, the edge of the Apennine front. Pan out far enough and you're looking at the history of a molten body, cooling, cracking, and being pummeled by a billion-year hailstorm of rock. The sample that would get named the Genesis rock is really an orthosite, light, plagioclase-rich crustal material that represents the flotation crust from the moon's magma ocean. When you hold something like that in a clean room, you're holding a time machine from the first few 100 million years of the solar system. Scott also staged one of those demonstrations that are so obvious you forget how persuasive they are. Drop a hammer and a feather in a vacuum, and they land together because gravity doesn't care how things feel to you. It cares only about mass and geometry. It's not a physics lecture. It's the simplicity of seeing an equation become a sight you will not forget. The service module on 15 carried something you can't see in the postcard photos. The sim bay, mapping cameras, spectrometers, and a small sub-satellite that would be deployed into lunar orbit. That was part of the quiet revolution that started with ALSEP. Stop thinking about the moon as a place you plant flags and start thinking about it as an object that maps, spectra, and isotopes can interrogate. On the way home, Al Worden stepped out of the command module in deep space to grab film canisters from those cameras. It's a spacewalk that doesn't get the press it deserves, performed not against the drama of a space station hull, but in the absolute open, with the spacecraft a silver punctuation mark against a black nothing that never blinks. 10 months later, April 1972, Apollo 16 took its rover to the Descartes Highlands. If you read the early mission science previews, there was a strong hypothesis that the site housed volcanic constructs, domes and flows unlike the mare basalts from earlier landings. The crew was John Young and Charlie Duke on the surface, Ken Mattingly in orbit. What they found, and what the samples later spelled out in chemical handwriting, was that the highlands are largely impact-made. Cataclysms make mountains. This is not an obvious story to tell the public, because our intuition draws volcanoes when we see a mound. On the moon, gravity's gentler pull and a lack of erosion freeze violence into shapes that mimic constructive geology. The ops side has its own memory of 16. A pre-landing scare with the service module's main engine parameters that put the touchdown on hold until analysis proved it was safe to proceed. You don't just land on a whiff of doubt. You validate. You protect your crew. And then you go, if the numbers let you. Down on the surface, one of the enduring sensory reports wasn't visual at all. When the hatch shut and they doffed helmets, both men described the way moon dust smelled. Gunpowder was the closest Earth analog they could find. It isn't gunpowder. It's reactive dust that's been beaten into sharp, fresh grains by micrometeorites for eons, with surface chemistry that plays tricks on human noses when it meets humidity and oxygen. It clings, it abrades, and it teaches you that future lunar crews will be dust managers as much as explorers. By the end of 1972, when Apollo 17 launched at night on a Saturn V that turned the coast into daylight, the politics had run ahead of the engineering. Public fascination had dulled, budgets had followed, and the number of discrete landings that had once been penciled onto whiteboards had been cut back. Within those constraints, NASA built the most scientific lunar campaign it could fit into one mission. The unique ingredient was Harrison Schmitt, a professional geologist trained to be a lunar module pilot instead of the other way around. It matters who you put in the suit. A field geologist reads rocks the way a surgeon reads anatomy, and that eye has a good habit of finding what checklists miss. The landing site, Taurus Littrow, gave them adjacency to young volcanic basalts and older highland materials, all framed by the south wall of a deep valley. Within that bowl, the rover could move across time by steering across the floor. The EVAs were long because the days were carefully metered by consumables, and the rover's reach made it worth pushing. There's a small mechanical story from 17 that I tell young engineers because it contains the DNA of operations. Early in the traverses, a fender on the rover got damaged. Dust began to plume up and coat everything. The fix wasn't elegant. It used spare maps and clamps to fashion a new fender. The point isn't that we were clever, although we were. The point is that robustness often means designing systems that can be hacked by their users with whatever is at hand. Modularity beats sleekness when the environment wants to grind you down. That patch kept dust off radiators, optics, and suits, which in turn preserved power margins, temperatures, and visibility. A good mission is 1,000 small saves like that. Schmidt's eye caught something nobody expected to see in a place the world imagined as monochrome: orange. When they trenched into the regolith at Shorty Crater, he saw tiny patches of colored soil, volcanic glass beads from ancient fire fountains. Under a microscope back on Earth, those spherules, rich in titanium and other elements, told a story of explosive volcanic activity more dynamic than the mare flooding we had already cataloged. The color pops in photographs, but the real shock is that a field geologist found it, not a lab after the fact. Sampling wasn't random. It was guided by an understanding of stratigraphy and context right there on the surface. Over 3 EVAs, the crew covered more than 30 kilometers in range, with single legs stretching several kilometers from the lander. That distance makes ops people nervous because every meter away is a meter. You have to walk back if something quits. The flight rules baked in margins, walk-back constraints, limits on how far you could be from the lander given your oxygen and water. The crew stayed within those lines while still pushing the map outward. 75 hours on the surface is the stat that makes headlines, but the more important numbers are in the core boxes. The inventory from 17 was the richest of the program. Well over 100 kilograms of rocks and soil split into hundreds of cataloged samples, each with a chain of context that lets you connect chemistry to geography and then to time. If you've ever read an age in a journal article, 3.6 billion years, 4.1 billion years, you're reading the quiet work of radiometric dating, done on those samples in labs that smell like solvents and sound like vacuum pumps. Those ages don't just tell a history of the moon. They pin down the tempo of the early solar system, when impacts were ferocious, when crusts formed, when volcanism flickered and died. Gene Cernan's words on the ladder before he headed back up have been quoted so many times they risk becoming wallpaper. The moral isn't the line itself, it's where it stands in the timeline. After that ascent, there were no more human bootprints on new lunar ground. The program ended not because it had reached a natural endpoint, but because the political and financial oxygen had thinned. Inside the industry, we had more sites circled, more hypotheses we wanted to test in person, more instruments we wanted to leave ticking away in the silence. We pivoted to orbiters, to telescopes, to robotic landers that do exquisite work without arguing back when the nights get cold. We teach ourselves to love the missions we can fly, even when we can picture the missions we can't. That's not melancholy, it's the discipline of reality. When you look back across 12 through 17, what you see is the professionalization of a frontier. The second landing proved targeting so that geology could be conducted like medicine, precise, deliberate, iterative. The seismometers and the other ALSEP components turned the moon into a long-term listening post, turning transient visits into continuous measurement. The 13 failure forced a culture to take its own rhetoric about safety and redundancy seriously, not as a speech, but as a system architecture. The 14 docking fight is the emblem of how routine problems are solved, with checklists you actually trust and crews who can think past frustration. The 15 rover rewired surface ops, converting astronauts from local walkers to regional surveyors, and introducing the unglamorous but central truth that dust is the boss. The 16 sampling pivoted a major scientific hypothesis because it replaced eyeballing with evidence. The 17 field geology, executed by a scientist astronaut, found things nobody penciled into the script because the right eyes were on the ground, and the instrument hall is still paying interest in dissertations and datasets half a century later. If you're looking for the operational DNA that ties this to modern programs, Orion, SLS, commercial landers, Artemis architectures, the threads are obvious. Precision landing isn't just swagger, it's logistics. If you can put down within walking distance of a predefined resources cache, a power grid node, or a science target, you multiply mission yield and slash crew exposure. The moon's mechanical properties, its high Q, the way it transmits and sustains seismic energy, mean that in situ construction, drilling, and blasting will behave differently than Earth intuition suggests. Dust is still the antagonist, and Apollo's lessons on suit seals, fender design, thermal control, and hatch etiquette should be engraved above the airlock of every future base. Rovers don't need to be pretty. They need to be field serviceable with limited tools. And when you pack your brains into the suit, make sure one of those brains is a field scientist. The moon rewards that kind of literacy. People often ask whether it was reckless to launch into a thunderstorm, to take the strike, to play roulette with a composite booster humming at millions of pounds of thrust. It wasn't roulette, it was a poor environmental choice, mitigated by a team that was ready to turn an obscure switch at the right time. The right answer today is that we would scrub and fly later. That's progress in attitude as much as in hardware. At the same time, don't confuse sobriety for timidity. The pace of Apollo was a function of national will, budgetary surge, and the willingness to grind through an operations tempo that would eat a modern workforce alive. We won't repeat that tempo, but we can keep the parts that were genuinely wise. Redundancy not as a checkbox, but as a philosophy. Training that rehearses the ridiculous because the ridiculous sometimes happens, and the humility to design for repair even when marketing prefers seamlessness. The other question that comes up is whether the moon is worth it, a word that hides 100 agendas. If you measure worth only in spectacle, you'll chase a single first step and then ask why the rest looks like work. If you measure worth in knowledge kept and skills built, 12 through 17 are a bargain. They built navigation and landing techniques we now take for granted in automated form. They taught us to think of extraterrestrial bodies as mechanical systems with their own failure modes, not just backgrounds for heroics. They gave us the samples that anchor chronologies for Earth, the Moon, and Mars. They trained a generation of engineers to solve the kind of problems that don't give you a warning chime before they become existential. The dividends of that training show up in places far from the moon. In flight software that doesn't panic when sensors disagree. In power systems that degrade gracefully. In thermal designs that don't die when they get dusty. And in crews that can improvise without lying to themselves about the cost of improvisation. There's something else, more human and less quantifiable. That lives in those missions. It's not romance, it's respect. You can admire the audacity of strapping into a pressure vessel atop a building-sized firework, but what holds admiration over time is the discipline that follows. When you watch Conrad and Bean lay out all-sep lines with measured steps so cabling won't snag, when you see Scott kneel into a position that protects a sample bag from contamination, when you hear Young's flat drawl as he confirms a number and then confirms it again, because you don't let your mouth outrun your checklist, you're watching a culture. It's the sum of 1,000 small right decisions. It's the refusal to be sloppy because the theater is good enough that nobody will notice. Anyone can get lucky once. Getting it right 6 times in 3 years means luck is a rounding error. The program ended with footprints pointing both directions, down to the surface and back up the ladder. It ended with a valley full of tracks and a checklist with no more boxes to tick. It ended with words about peace and hope, because there wasn't a better way to mark the end of a particular kind of human effort than to say out loud what all that effort was supposed to serve. The files closed, the hardware retired, and the lab stayed busy. We kept listening to the seismometers until they went quiet. We kept grinding thin sections of rock and reading their ages. We kept thinking about a return, not as nostalgia, but as the next logical phase of fieldwork interrupted. Every time you see an artist's concept for a lunar base or a CAD model for a lander with stubby legs and pads shaped to bite into regolith, you're seeing the ghost of Apollo in the features that matter. Dust guards, redundant comms, handholds in the right places, sample bags that close quickly with gloved fingers, redline values that aren't a dare but a law. The moon is unchanging, but our methods have matured. So when you ask what actually happened on the moon, after the line everyone remembers, the answer is that we learned how to work. We learned how to land where we said we would. We learned to leave instruments that would talk to us long after the human voices were gone. We learned what the ground is made of, how old it is, and how it came to be shaped into highlands and seas by violence more ancient than any mountain range on Earth. We learned that human attention coupled with good tools outperforms any checklist written in advance, and that good checklists save lives when attention falters. We learned that television is a footnote when the job is science. We learned that errors become legends only if you survive them, and that surviving them requires the unglamorous work of being ready. We learned that a rover doesn't have to be fast to be liberating. We learned that sometimes the most important color on a gray world is a patch of orange you find because your eye is trained to notice what doesn't fit. Above all, we learned to treat another world not as a backdrop, but as a partner in an investigation, a place you can listen to, measure, and understand. The postcard image still belongs on the wall because it's beautiful and because first steps are rare pleasures. But if you stand in front of that image long enough and let the rest of the story fill in, it stops being a monument and starts being a map. The lines that extend from it are the traversal routes, the sampling stations, the instrument footprints, the orbits traced by cameras whose film was plucked out of the vacuum by a man who closed his hands carefully so he wouldn't lose any. The map still has blank spaces. They aren't there because we failed. They're there because we paused. When we resume, the rules that made those 6 landings so consequential will be the ones that make the next 6 a foundation instead of a novelty. Land precisely. Measure continuously. Respect dust Designed for repair? Train for the unexpected. Put scientists in the suit. And when the camera breaks because the world is brighter than you accounted for, keep working. The signal that matters isn't always the one you broadcast home. Sometimes the signal is a seismic whisper in a rigid crust, or a small scoop of beads that gleam when they catch the sun at just the right angle. Sometimes it's a voice across the loop, calling out an obscure switch that buys you back a mission. That's what actually happened on the moon. Not myth, not magic. Work. And from work, a kind of understanding that keeps making us better at the next hard thing.